Okay, so welcome everyone to the Somatic Therapy Masterclass. Very, very excited to share some information with you today. We are going to go through a lot of different things in this presentation. We want to pack as much as we can into the time that we have available. So any questions, you can put them in the comments. We are going to have a Q&A at the end. So we'll allocate as much time as we need depending on how many questions there are at the end, and we'll make sure everything gets answered for you. So without further ado, let's jump into the presentation. So let's talk about what we're going to cover in today's masterclass. So we're going to talk about what's actually being explored in somatic therapy. We have so many people on this call already. It's fantastic. I'm sure you're all at different points. Maybe you are a somatic therapist in some form already. Maybe you've done sessions as a client with it and it's something you want to learn more about. Or maybe you've just heard the term and you're like, hey, I want to know a little bit more about this. So we want to really tailor this so there's something for everybody, basically. Matt and I will get into who we are and the work that we do in a minute, but we believe that working somatically in the body is going to be the way forward when helping with different issues with mental health, addictions, coping mechanisms, physical issues, and we're going to get into all that today. We're going to talk about how to identify traumatic imprints in the body and the components of a traumatic imprint. That is a big part when we're working with the body. Also, the importance of including the body in therapy, and also what effective somatic therapy looks like. And we're going to go through the components of what would be involved in a session to do it effectively. And we're also going to go through a whole flow chart of kind of what we take clients through, and also practitioners that we train in what a session looks like. So let's talk about the terrain of the inner world when we're working in the body. There's a few components that we work with, which a lot of people, especially if they've done a lot of talk therapy or they're a talk therapist, kind of go, oh, whoa, this is unfamiliar territory that we have to cover when we're working in the body. So I might read these out one at a time and maybe, Matt, get your take on a few of those. But when we're working in the body with clients, we're talking about emotional echoes. So we call them emotional echoes because when we're working in the body, we find there's a lot of emotional imprints. Oftentimes people think the emotions they feel in their day-to-day life are new emotions, but the vast majority of time they're not. They're these what we would call echoes from the past, these emotional patterns and suppressed feelings within the body. Also, somatic sensations that most people are unaware of. As a society, most of us have become disembodied, which means we kind of live primarily above the neck, up in the mind, in thinking and cognizing and interpreting our experience. When we come down into the body, we can find there can be many sensations, not all of them comfortable, that we need to meet in order to start to work through them. Also, memories can arise when we're navigating this terrain, not just conscious memories that we think back to, but things that may have been suppressed or repressed for our safety at the time. Also, memories that the body holds that the conscious mind won't remember. Also, subconscious imagery as well. So, Matt, do you want to maybe talk about some of the terrain of that inner world when working in the body?
Yeah, so, when you use the term sort of somatic therapy, obviously soma is our body, but I think fundamentally, what we need is a shift of orientation rather than trying to resolve a problem by thinking about it and finding answers and coming to sort of definite cognitive sort of conclusions. We need to start to explore the body. And when I say explore the body, I don't mean like, finding what bones are made of and giving that a name or exploring what the fascia is. I mean the feeling of our body, the feeling of what it feels like to be in our body. That's what we're exploring. And so somatic therapy means to me is bringing our attention and our awareness into the felt sense of my body. So essentially, it's a practice of presence, because we're learning to be present. I can't go into my felt sense yesterday. I may get images come up out of my felt sense of what happened yesterday, but I can't go into those images. I have to go into the felt sense of my body. And so essentially, we learn to be present with different contractions and different sort of energies, feelings of density or vitality, even feelings of anxiety or activation or shutdown responses. And we go into how that feels in our gut, in our heart, in our shoulders, in our jaws, in our legs, in our calves, in our ankles, in our feet, in our hands, all over our body. And so that's what comes to me when I think of somatic sensations, that's the best sort of description I can give. And in that felt sense exists, so many emotional echoes, emotions from the past. So anything that we don't sort of have the capacity to integrate in the moment, to fully experience, so we may dissociate, we may build defenses against certain structures or certain emotions, say, in infancy, our mother's highly stressed and we may be in a state of anxiety. We may build defenses against that anxiety and really suppress it, orphan it, shut it down, and then that anxiety will come up later in life. Show up as just background, chronic sort of feeling unsafe in whatever we do. And so these sort of emotions, they echo throughout our lives, and they can get suppressed or they can sort of go dormant for a while, and then something might happen. Say we're in a relationship and our partner says something, it could trigger that echo, and it sort of like bounces up to the surface, and we start experiencing the same emotion that we were experiencing when we were 5, 6, 7, 10, 15, whenever the event happened. And then the memories can be the associated memories can come up with that. So we might get the images of our mother. It might just be a real feeling memory as well. It doesn't have to be images, but often it is. It can be memories in the sense of it's just the mind's interpretation. So before we create cognitive memory, we might get archetypical images or representations of what our mind imagines happened, but not necessarily what happened. And that sort of applies to subconscious imagery as well.
Yeah, really.
So that's the terrain.
Yeah, and a lot of people are like, whoa, that's pretty, intense terrain, and that's what causes a lot of trepidation in people. But, by the end of this, we want to really help you understand that, whether it's, 2%, 10%, 15%, we just want to help you understand this terrain a lot better so that you can navigate it within yourself and also start to understand it better if you're working with clients, because I'm sure there's a lot of practitioners on here as well. So having a map is essential. So one thing that we want to give you out of this talk is that you'll understand a blueprint for including the body in therapy based on ancient wisdom and the latest in neuroscience. That's the two things that Matt and I try and combine all the time. We love all the ancient wisdom stuff. We're actually talking about a lot of that before we press record but also the latest in neuroscience. I think when we combine those two, then we can see really effective somatic therapy start to play out. And just a note as well, if you stay to the end of the talk, we've got a special offer. Obviously, we're going to pack as much as we can into the hour or so that we have together now. But if you do want to dive deeper and look at some of the trainings that we have, we're going to talk about that at the end. So a little bit on us. We don't want to spend too much time, banging on about our story. But myself and Matt are extremely passionate about this topic. We believe empowering individuals with the understanding and skills to help themselves and others relieve stress and trauma in the body will in fact change the world. We see so much of what's happening individually and collectively, especially the last couple of years, as these trauma responses in the body held in the soma playing out on these mass scales. And it's our mission to help people understand these things and also heal one at a time. Myself and Matt have a history of dealing with mental health issues, with addictions, all of that kind of stuff. That's what led us getting into this work and get really into it. And we had to actually get into our bodies and deal with a lot of these imprints in order to leave our old lives behind. That's led us to creating a modality called Embodied Processing, where we help people and train practitioners in working with in the body, and a lot of the concepts we're going to be talking about today is involved in that practitioner training. Is there anything else you want to say about our story, Matt, or that pretty much covers it?
No, that covers it. Just like on the, you're saying our perspective is a lot of, the dysfunction we see in the world is a response to trauma and distress, and we're, collectively acting from a dysregulated nervous system. Essentially from a place of survival rather than thriving and growth. I think, learning to work somatically, because we can't prevent, traumatic type experiences from happening. We couldn't prevent the pandemic, but we can prevent ongoing traumatic imprints from those experiences. So it's also preventative. We can prevent children growing up with developmental trauma and resulting in addictions and lots of, antisocial, as they call it, type behaviors and, all of that sort of stuff. So the preventative for future generations is a part that's really important to me as well, being a parent myself.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about identifying traumatic imprints in the body. So oftentimes when we look at our life, life will tend to show us where we're stuck and where we may have blockages, imprints, constrictions in the body. So we have here, we can look at looping patterns in someone's life, whether it's their life circumstances or different thought patterns. Self sabotage, if you are working with clients or noticed your own life, I know for me, you will notice that nearly everybody has some form of self sabotage going on. And that is basically when one part of us, let's say our conscious mind, tends to have these hopes, dreams, and desires. So it sees something out here that it wants. And then there's another part of them that is much deeper, much stronger, and more based in our survival physiology in the body, preventing us from going and get that thing. So we're at a split, so to speak. And a lot of people get very, very frustrated at themselves and heap a lot more guilt and shame on themselves for not going after the things that they want, when it is oftentimes these self-sabotage patterns and things that are happening in the body, which is stopping people from doing that. And then also densities in the felt sense. Matt, do you want to maybe touch on those densities in the felt sense?
Sure. As I was saying before, when we're talking about somatic therapy, we're talking about going into the felt sense. And I just talk about sort of my own experience. The feeling of my gut, there was always this sense of such a deep contraction. It's almost like my breath couldn't get past it. I remember, going into breathwork sessions like years ago, and it really hurt to breathe past this just above the belly button, the solar plexus there, because it felt like there was this unbelievable density. And as I sort of learned to work with that just through the felt sense of it, through going deeply into it, almost going into the center of it, like I'd walk into a room and find what was inside that density. So, just to highlight the difference between that sort of orientation and psychology is, I could spend years talking about the density, trying to reframe it, trying to find a solution to it, just talking about it, trying to find a resolution that way through thinking. But what was required was for me to sink down into it. And, in that felt sense was layers and layers of terror, of rage, of helplessness, of despair, heaps of different sort of suppressed psychic structures that were held in my physical body. It was, and I started to get really, really bad back pain, from it, like a really hunched over posture. It was affecting, the way I walked, the way I talked, the way I related to people. Everything was this hunched over sort of defensive posture that I was taking. And that's what oriented my whole life, this density in the felt sense. And so going into it, it was like, 25 years of compacted, ongoing traumatic experiences that were mainly, that felt like where a lot of it was centered, where I held it. And a lot of people hold it in different places. And as I sort of moved a lot of it through, my posture started to change, the way I walked changed, the way I talked changed, the way I held myself in the world, the way I viewed the world, the way I viewed myself. All those things started to sort of change naturally from this unraveling. It wasn't like I needed to restructure my identity. What happened was, as this felt sense of who I was started to unravel, what was left was a more authentic expression of myself. I didn't actually have to try and work on it and change all my beliefs or anything like that. It was a natural result of sort of like removing the clouds that were obscuring my own sort of authenticity and naturalness.
Yeah, really good explanation. One thing as well that results from starting to work through these densities is that we have more energy as well. So many people are struggling with low energy and always being tired and run down and using, coffee and everything to get through the day. And the analogy that I like is that, our energy is like a big stream, like a river, and it's flowing and it's free flowing ideally. And there's plenty of power there. There's plenty of juice. And then what happens is we start to go through life and we start to accumulate these traumatic imprints. And you'll see in the next slide, I believe it is, how seemingly insignificant, looking back on it, these imprints can be. But we all store them to a varying degree. And every time we do store one within the body, it's like we put a rock in that river. And there might be pebbles, there might be larger rocks, some might be boulders, but over time we start to block the flow of that river. And we get to a certain age, then all of a sudden the water kind of has to fight to get through all the rocks, and only a trickle is coming out the other end. And that's where a lot of people find themselves with low energy. And, I have met people who are in their 70s who have like way more energy than me. And that's because they have been able to remove a lot of these rocks and become that authentic expression. So I think a lot of us tend to use the idea of, hey, well, I'm getting to a certain age, so I have lower energy, when oftentimes it's these densities in the felt sense, which when worked through can free up a lot of that energy.
It's talking about ancient traditions, the perspective of Chinese medicine would be blockages in the qi, sort of like water flowing, but bits have become frozen. And so from our perspective, or traumatic imprints is anything that causes us to contract, and that contraction never completes itself and comes back to resolution. And that happens within the physical body. We can feel it. Someone says something to us, we contract physically. That is insulting, or something horrible happens in front of us, we physically contract. And so these are the densities, and they need to find some sort of resolution, completion. It needs to be discharged, and then the water or the qi, can flow more freely.
Yeah. So let's talk about the components of a traumatic imprint now. Now, classically, I mean, a lot of you on this call are going to have an awareness already and understand this, but classically, most people have thought of trauma as something happening to us, like sexual abuse, physical abuse, a veteran being away at war and seeing or doing horrible things, of a car crash and that kind of thing, which is definitely is trauma, but that's what we would call acute trauma. And there are different categories of trauma. There's developmental trauma, pre-conscious trauma, genealogical trauma, collective trauma. We won't go deep into all of those today because I don't have enough time, but there are different categories. And one thing myself and Matt are very passionate about is developmental trauma, because it really is a symptom of the West and the way that we live in our society. And a lot of people end up as adults with depression, anxiety, bipolar, addictions, alcoholism, workaholism, and they don't know why. And it's a lot of it is to do with this developmental trauma piece. And one myth is that trauma is the thing that happened, but trauma is what happens inside of us as a result of external stimulus. So in that way, trauma is very subjective. What is traumatic for one human being may or may not be traumatic for another human being. And I think we'll give some examples in a minute. But if we have a look at these 4 points here, basically before we jump into them, the first two, Matt spoke about the loops, and Peter Levine, who's a pioneer in this industry, talks about the loops as well. It's like a loop starts and then ideally a loop finishes, meaning that our nervous system and that emotional energy finds completion and discharge. But as human beings, we're not taught how to do that and don't have a safe space to do that. So we have all these unopened loops that remain unopened, which would be a traumatic imprint. So the second 2 dot points are a result of the first 2 not finding completion. So basically an event happens in our life where there is a perceived threat. Okay, and that can be a threat to our physical safety, or more often than not, it's a threat to our identity or our psychological self. So our nervous system starts to go into a stress response. So FFF there means fight, flight, freeze. Also fawn is probably another F that we can use. But basically our nervous system goes into an aroused state or a shutdown state and tries to work out, how am I best going to survive this perceived threat that's happening in my environment. We also then have emotional energy that can get stored within our body. So that can be guilt, shame, anger, fear, sadness, hurt. It can be a combination of those. But when we don't properly know how to process that, or don't have a stable resource to help us do that, then that does get stored within our body. That's why we can think back to something that happened 10, 15, 20 years ago. And as soon as we start thinking about it, that same emotion that was there at the time starts to happen in our body. And that's where it does happen, right? It's like when I ask people who are experiencing sadness, where do you feel it? They never point to their head. Where do you feel guilt? It's like, I never point to my head. Yeah, it's always in the body, the heart, the stomach, shoulders, some variation of that. What will happen when our nervous system goes into this stress response, it will look around for a resource of safety. It'll look around for someone or something to try and help regulate a very dysregulated nervous system. When we are younger, that is ideally our parents or caregivers. What will happen then, if we don't find completion and don't have a stable resource, we can start to create some painful narratives about ourselves or the world. We can decide that the world is inherently not a safe place. We can decide that there is something wrong with us. We can decide that we're not worthy of love or unlovable in some way. There are many different narratives that we can create. All of them are stories of deficiency as a human being. And then what happens, we create what we call orphaned parts, which are these split off parts of us, basically. And they split off so that they can kind of keep an eye out in future scenarios to alert us if something similar is going to happen, because it was so stressful and resulted in so much emotional pain. Now, as we grow up to adulthood in the West, we don't have one or two orphaned parts. We got dozens, maybe hundreds lurking out here somewhere. And so what happens, we're sort of essentially always looking out for something that's going to be a threat. And so we end up in a hypervigilant state. And so many people in our culture are in a hypervigilant state most of the time. And then the result of that is we use alcohol, drugs, whatever it is to try and help soothe that. So Matt, do you want to maybe give an example of how this plays out? Maybe the kid in school or something similar?
Yeah, sure. And so like, something to add to this is part of the response is the creation of a survival adaptation within us. So, if we use an example of, say, we're at school, we're in grade 1, and the teacher's explaining something we don't quite understand, and we put our hand up to ask a question, and everyone in the classroom sort of laughs because it's a bit of an off-topic question. It shows I don't understand things, and etc. And the moment everyone laughs, we can feel that contraction within ourselves, like, oh, something in me says, you idiot, why'd you ask that question? In that moment, I'm looking for a stable resource, or I need a stable resource. And so maybe the teacher walks over, gets down to my level, makes eye contact and says, it's okay, Matt. That contraction completes itself. And it's sort of like, everyone knows that feeling of, like it's safe, like I'm okay. So the teacher would be the stable resource in that moment. But say she doesn't, say she just turns around and carries on with the blackboard or has a little giggle herself. That contraction will lock. And I will keep experiencing that. And there's, many factors that will weigh in on whether this becomes a trauma from someone, and that's all dependent on the sensitivity of their nervous system, how they're developed, their relationship with their mother, all that sort of, way too technical to get into now, but just to sort of cover this, this so we can come to some sort of understanding, is if that contraction never completes itself and finds resolution, I could then, as a survival adaptation, take that into the next situation, and I might not understand something the teacher's saying and go to put my hand up and something contracts and says, don't do it. So the survival adaptation then is keeping me safe from expressing myself. It's not safe to express myself, which then can, in time, become a personality trait, and people can think he's just a shy person. In any public forum, that contraction activates and I don't speak. Or I might say, come over here to one of my good friends and just speak to them privately. I can't speak out in the open because of that experience and that imprint that happened, that nervous system, that child's nervous system that went into overwhelm and was never resourced or felt safe enough to come out of it. So the stored emotional energy, the survival stress is still there. The fear is still there, the shame's still there. All of those things are looping patterns. The narratives, like, you idiot, that's still there. Anytime I do that, like, there's something wrong with you, you can't even talk to people, rah, rah, rah. So I get this big narrative going on. And so then I've orphaned these parts of myself. I've orphaned my authentic expression. I've orphaned the part of myself that is curious and wants to know and wants to ask questions. So I split off and I fragment, So just something as simple as that just happens in our day-to-day life can leave quite a traumatic imprint, which then creates these personality traits, which are actually adaptations and trauma responses, and not who I really am, not part of my authenticity. And so that is part of how it can play out symptomatically, and you can apply that example to so many different areas of our lives. When I really started to unravel this and see it, it was like my whole personality is a trauma response. The way I function in the world is a response to trauma. Everything I do is oriented around survival. I think that's a lot the case for a lot of people.
Yeah, well, it's like, are we acting out of survival and fear, or creation, inspiration? And then most people, and I know this is obviously yours and my journey for a lot of our life, is that the creativity, inspiration is almost non-existent, and pretty much every action is taken out of a place of fear and survival. And we just kind of gradually end up there. And, like I said before, so we end up with hypervigilance, and like most decisions that we make are ones based on fear. Like, how am I going to keep myself most safe in this next moment and reduce that fear that I'm feeling? And someone commented actually, sorry, go Matt.
I was just going to say that more is specifically looking at, development and the development of personality traits and how the personality becomes oriented around survival. Acute trauma would be more, experiencing one single event that puts the body into shock or into shutdown or into dissociation or freeze, etc. And we can't get out of that. That never completes itself. That's much easier to resolve than someone who suffered these developmental trauma traits, to more extremities. I think everyone does to certain degrees.
Yep. Yeah, and someone has commented about people with a more sensitive disposition. You can look up Dr. Elaine Aron's work, The Highly Sensitive Person. She's probably done the best and most extensive scientific research on people with, basically it just means having a more sensitive nervous system. Now, why it ended up that way, I mean, that's a topic for another discussion. Could be argued it's genetic to an extent, could be argued something happened in the womb early on when the nervous system was developing, pre-conscious stuff. We won't get into that, but basically it says around 15 to 20% of the population would be classified as a HSP, a highly sensitive person, which would mean they're just more susceptible to some of these traumatic imprints. They're also more susceptible to being some of the most brilliant and creative people on the planet. And you'll see a lot of people who be artists, musicians, comedians, all of that will tend to be therapists, will tend to be highly sensitive people. So this is once again how trauma is very subjective, and what is, see, for something like sexual abuse or extreme bullying early on at school, that's going to be traumatic for 99.99% of people. But there are other instances which may be traumatic for 50% of people. There may be some that are only traumatic for 10% of people. It's a very subjective experience. And the issue that we can get into here is that we start to compare. So we start to look at ourselves and go, well, what happened to me wasn't that bad. I shouldn't be still reacting this way all these years later, which is once again piling shame on ourselves. One of my favorite quotes is, comparison is the thief of joy. And in this context, comparison is not a good thing because it's very, very subjective what we go through in terms of these imprints. So now we'll talk about including the body in therapy. I'm looking at comments as we're going along. I just want to make sure that we get everything answered. If not now, then at the end. So when we talk about including the body in therapy, we'll talk about where maybe talk therapy doesn't cut it. Talk therapy has its place for many things. We're not here to, bash talk therapy. We just believe a top-down talk therapy and a bottom-up approach, like what we're talking about, I think addressing both of those, is very, very important. But when we're talking about these densities in the body and these traumatic imprints, there's a really good term that I like. I can't remember who coined it, but it was called the true-iron brain. And it's not physiologically correct, but it's a good way to think about it. If you think about our brain in three parts in terms of our evolution. So the oldest part of our brain, which you would call the reptilian part of our brain, which would be the cerebellum and the brainstem. Then the next part to evolve was the limbic system, where we have more complex emotions going on there. And someone in the comments asked about the limbic system. This should hopefully answer that question. And then we have the neocortex, which is the most recent, newly evolved part of the brain. When we go through these experiences of a potentially traumatic imprint and perceived threat, the blood flow comes out of our neocortex and goes into these older parts of our brain. So when these imprints are actually stored within these deeper parts of our brain and our nervous system and body, we're not in that neocortex and that conscious part. Yet when we start to do talk therapy a bit later or years later, it's like we're trying to use that neocortex to solve the problem of the limbic and the reptilian brain. So that's why we need to actually come back into those parts of the brain, that part of our survival physiology, in order to resolve those, because that's the state that we were in at the time of the imprint. Anything you want to add to that, Matt?
Just like I use the metaphor of a fish, say like a koi fish in a pond. If I put my hand down into the water near the koi fish, it will knee-jerk reaction, swim in the other direction. So that reaction, it's sort of like an autonomic motor response. It's a survival reaction. It's just, it doesn't need to think about it. It happens prior to cognition, even though fish don't have cognition. But it just darts in the other direction. This part of our brain that governs these sort of survival responses are said to be, 400, 500 million years old. And so they're the areas, the same thing that makes a fish go and dart in the other direction is the same part of the brain in us that governs these survival responses. And so when that reaction isn't allowed to complete itself, that's when it stores as a density. And so just talking about it, sorry, motorbike outside. Just talking about it doesn't cut it. It's similar to trying to resolve a broken leg by talking about it over and over and over. The healing has to happen on a different level, and talk therapy can work great in conjunction with it. But if we don't actually work with the felt sense and in these more primal regions, then sort of like rearranging the furniture on the Titanic, or decorating dog shit. It's sort of like we can change things how they look on the surface, but nothing changes at the core of things. And so transformation, in our view, has to happen from the ground up. It has to happen to the very core.
And so we've got the word there, cognitive bypassing, and what that can look like. I've seen it with so many clients. It's like, the topic of dad might come up, and all of a sudden, being a somatic therapist, you can you notice densities or contractions starting to happen in the body, even if the client isn't aware of it. And then they might say, I worked with a coach a few years ago, and we did an exercise where I forgave him, and so I've forgiven him, it's all fine. And then that's when we'd start to go, well, do you mind if we explore that in the body? Because I'm getting a bit of a different sense here. And that's when we start to realize, as we come into the body and you can navigate the terrain and help someone in there, they realize that in their body, in their felt sense, they still fucking hate dad and have so much anger and rage in the system. But cognitively, we haven't come into the body and felt it and worked through it with a guided practitioner completely. And I did that exercise and I've forgiven him. When the body can often have a very, very different story. And it's very, very important that we understand that story. So much of us have so much latent anger and rage at our parents, even if they were, great parents, and obviously everyone's doing the best they can. So many people have anger and rage that they don't want to become aware of, because feel like if they acknowledge it, then they have to blame their parents. And also they just don't want to feel it in general. So really, really important. And the last one is just touching on our psychological versus our somatic identity. It's really, really important to understand, somatic identity, same thing as felt sense of who we are. But most people identify with this psychological concepts around who they are as a human being. I'm Ryan. I train therapists. I'm a father. I like golf. I do this. It's all concepts. When really our somatic identity is, who am I in this moment right now inside my body? Because that's where we live. We think that we live out here, but every experience that we're having, even when I'm being a dad or playing golf, I'm still living in here. And so it's very, very important to acknowledge that that's where we want to work and investigate, as opposed to just playing around with our roles in society. Let's now talk about some of the components of effective somatic therapy. Before we jump into some of the components that Matt and I teach, it's important to think about these two phrases here. Before we get into, I suppose there's the mechanics of like, hey, what kind of points should I be hitting in a session where we're working with trauma or working in the body? But the first thing is, from what place am I coming from? Do I have an agenda here? One of the phrases that we teach in Embodied Processing is all is welcome here. So no matter what comes up in the body, whether there's certain memories, whether there's subconscious imagery, language, sensations, emotions, it's all welcome here. Human beings are so used to being judged in our society. And when you can come to a place where you're working with someone where you don't feel judged, great healing can take place. Now, the issues that we see people run into is, a practitioner either may not have worked through their own stuff to the right extent, meaning that they haven't cleared something, or they don't have the capacity to contain certain things that come up, which means that, if I have unresolved issues with my mum and then a client brings up some stuff with mum, then I'm going to get myself involved with a session or may not want them to go there. So really, really important that we get to a point where all is welcome. Matt, do you want to also talk about the mentality of people needing to feel like they're getting fixed when they're going to therapy?
Yeah. It's such a common thing in Western culture, especially. It's like, you take a Panadol or paracetamol. Panadol's paracetamol in Australia. They call it something different in other countries, but take a paracetamol and your headache goes away. It's just like this quick fix mentality. Like we might read something on trauma on Facebook or see a Facebook Live like this and say, all right, now I'm going to go to a trauma therapist for 10 sessions and fix my trauma. that can come from an orientation that I'm broken and something needs fixing. And so we're already entering the journey from a place of deficiency. And so, I like to say we need, a shift of orientation, one from agenda focused to exploration focused, inquiry focused. So, if I welcome in this part of me, what's it like to just explore it, to accept it, to welcome it in unconditionally, and rather than have the the agenda to invite it in so I can get rid of it, which is just another way of abandoning and orphaning these parts of myself. Can I invite them in to sort of love them back to life, to integrate them? Can I make them my friends? We've spent our whole lives resisting these parts and keeping them at bay and keeping them suppressed. But can we change that orientation? So can I make them my friends? Like, we're inviting the enemy in for dinner to make peace and get to know them. So it's a different, orientation. Just explore them. And if the practitioner come from that place and hold that space of allowing within themselves, it can make all the difference for the client as well.
Yeah, and that's those orphan parts that we were talking about in the components of trauma. It's like, can we start to safely welcome them back in and understand them? Because so many of us, it's like, oh yeah, I'll welcome that part and that part back in, but I'm not fucking letting that part back in. And so we have these parts of us that we hate. Like, we despise these certain parts of us, and part of this process is being able to contain them and understand them, and then get to a place of acceptance and forgiveness, which is so important. Because as long as we're hating one part of us, we can't be whole. Yeah, we'll always have a story of deficiency there. All right, let's talk about some of the components now of effective trauma therapy. The first one is creating a somatic awareness. It's helping someone get more in touch with the felt sense. I spoke about how society is largely disembodied these days and living up in the mind, and there's a very, very good reason for that, because as soon as we start to come back down into the body, all of these disturbances, these imprints, all of these rocks and boulders in the river become very, very apparent. So it doesn't take long before we jump back up into the mind and start doing. And this is why early on it can take the help of a practitioner to start to work through this stuff, to start to be able to hold space for what's coming up in your body, so you can learn that, yes, it's okay for me to be there for this stuff as well. I tell a story a bit years ago. Before I, got into any of this work, I heard about the term, meditation, and I thought it's something that I would have to try. And one day I got home from work and decided I was going to meditate. I was someone who would get home immediately from work and turn on TV, radio, like always have noise on. And I remember I turned everything off, and I lasted about 12 seconds before I went, stuff this, and turned everything back on and stopped meditating. I didn't realize it at the time, but because coming into my body was such an unsafe and uncomfortable place for me to be. And I didn't have anyone to help guide me in those early stages. So somatic awareness is the first one. The next one is actually starting to find a resource. Matt, do you want to talk about what a resource is and why that's important?
Yeah, so, like in the example that I said earlier about the teacher, if they came, eye contact, like it's okay. That's a resource. The teacher is an acting resource then. But we can cultivate inner resources. A resource could be going for a walk, in the forest. A resource could be a place like a waterfall that we go to, even a waterfall that we go to in our imagination. A resource is anywhere that we can go that can help regulate our nervous system, help us to find a sense of safety. And so what happens is, when we're in a contracted energy, it might be making a cup of tea. Tea's always been a good resource for me. Have a cup of tea and it's like, if I'm tense or stressed about something, a tea will help relax. And I've had teas my whole life. So that it's anything that we can learn to build association with a sense of safety. And maybe the word safety is triggering for some people. Maybe safety can mean feeling smothered, or it can be a trigger. So we could use words like grounded, presence, regulated, open, spacious, still, or whatever word works for you. And so we cultivate a resource in EP, and that comes from sort of Peter Levine's type work, as he says, building islands of safety within the body.
Yeah, I love that. It's like when we accumulate these imprints, there was no resource present. So we must learn to actually build a resource within ourselves, so these imprints can come back in and start to be dissolved into that safety. And there are different ways that we can go about that. The next one is what we spoke about really in the previous slide, like from that now having somatic awareness and creating a resource of safety, and we can now start to invite in these old parts, knowing that we can come back to the resource if ever things get too overwhelming or intense. Ideally with these orphaned parts as well, we're trying to find the origin. When did this imprint start? By going back and locating the imprint, it's sort of the original, when the echo started, so to speak. And we can use certain language and ask certain questions around that. You know, that could be something that happened 1 year ago. It could be something that happened when we were 10 or 5 or, 1 in the womb, all of that kind of stuff. But we want to find the origin. And then we start to, with a skilled practitioner, we start to, work through the sensation, start to process what comes up. Like I spoke about earlier, if we have undigested life experiences and then we think back to that experience, 10 years ago, whenever it was, a lot of sensation from back then becomes active. That's literally an orphaned part becoming reactivated in the moment. It'll happen when we think about it consciously or when our subconscious mind perceives something similar might happen in our environment. Normally then our natural human inclination is to try and distract ourselves and move away from that. What we teach is be able to start to go into that and process those sensations that come up, because what was not safe for us to experience at the time can be safe because now we're an adult and we can build that resource of safety. I think it might be in Bessel van der Kolk's book, Body Keeps the Score, but he talks about, when the body knows it's over, it's over. There's another thing probably coming back to talk therapy, phrases like time heals all wounds. It just doesn't apply to what we're talking about here, because what we're talking about, time doesn't exist. When I have an orphaned part that becomes active, my nervous system literally thinks we're back at that originating event. And so time doesn't exist in that context.
Just like it's proof, time is a cognitive experience. But someone's asked if these parts, are we speaking of the same as IFS parts, internal family systems? I assume so. That what's the guy's name who created it?
Dick Schwartz.
Yeah, him. I assume like he sort of came to these same sort of discoveries through his own sort of internal investigation. We've got thousands of parts, like internal families.
Yeah. So in that, just to give a little summation, so we would deal with whatever part arises, all of those hundreds or even thousands of parts, and deal with them specifically. IFS would put them into categories. So their categories are, the managers, the exiles, the firefighters. There might be one more in there. So basically, it's similar, but a little bit different in that respect. We have a few.
Creative.
Yeah, we have a few IFS practitioners in our training, and it's quite different. But there are a few similarities there. Yes.
Yeah. And someone asked as well, how do we go from letting this part in so I can get rid of it to unconditionally let it in? Naturally, we want these parts to pass because they scare us or disgust us. Is it understanding that they're not just one thing like anger, but they're like a person that can change and shift? The part that disgusts me could become my best friend. Well, it's, I think like understanding them objectively, a big part of it is identification, that we see that it's not actually who we are, that it's just a survival adaptation. It's just a part of us that has adapted this way. We can learn to start to see it really objectively. And when we're seeing something objectively, we can explore it. If I invite it in and I'm identified with it and the voice is, I hate myself, I'm disgusting, I can't believe I think that, or I want to hurt that person, or I can't believe I did that, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if I'm identified with that voice, there's going to be an internal struggle to try and get out of it because it's really, really uncomfortable. But we grow in our capacity to do this. It's a skill that we acquire, and it can, be sped up a lot by having a therapist who can guide you through the process, or a practitioner. But we learn to sort of invite it in and stay in a position of, say, passive witnessing, or curious and inquiring into it, not identifying with it, but seeing it objectively. And we can invite it in, and that's actually what starts to bring about integration. So long as we're identified in it and, sort of marinating in the misery of it, that's not really inviting it in and exploring it. That's sort of becoming it, that's letting myself become one with it, rather than seeing it as an object happening within what I am. I hope that makes sense. But like I said, this is something we grow in our capacity to do.
It can be quite subtle. It's a natural. So we think if I'm inviting in a part that really disgusts me, I naturally want that to go away. And it's just like this subtle shift for, can I invite that in and start to befriend and understand that? And then integration can start to happen the more we're able to contain that part. But like Matt said, as soon as we have the intention, like, yeah, I'm welcoming it in, okay, hurry up and integrate so you can go away, that actually stops integration or greatly prolongs it. So once again, these are subtle shifts, but we have different techniques that we teach around this. One that's really can be quite powerful is, as soon as we start to have some capacity to hold a part, then we start to play with phrases like, can this be here forever? And you see the psyche just bends. It doesn't like that. But as soon as we start to explore that and play with that in the body, then integration can start to happen. It's a little bit paradoxical in that sense.
And like I said, it can be really, really helpful to have a practitioner be guiding us, especially when we're first starting.
Absolutely. So let's now put that into practice and just give you a little bit of a rundown of, this is actually the flow chart for our practitioner training, embodied processing, and what a session looks like. So we'll run through this relatively quickly here, but we'll show you kind of what a session can look like. And one thing that we teach all of our pracs is, we need to learn things mechanically, step by step. But as we start to become more confident and understand the terrain, we can kind of mix things up here, and it does become more of an art form than a mechanical process. So obviously in this, we obviously need to work on what is being looked at in a session or investigated. Some people will come in and go, hey, I've got this specific thing that happened 10 years ago that I need to look at, and we can kind of jump into that. Most people, however, we look at their life circumstances today and what's happening for them in order to try and work out where an imprint started. So, a lot of people will come in and say, I've got this issue in relationship, I can't express my needs, or I can't speak up, or I don't feel heard. And we can start to explore that in the body and find out its deeper roots and its deeper origins. We then have 3 different options there for building a resource of safety. We can use those, or we use a combination of those. For people who've had a lot of traumatic imprints and been through a lot in their life, they may have lost any sense of safety in their body for years or decades. I know that was my experience. It was a good 25 years I didn't feel safe in my body at all. So early on, we can use these different options. It's like just planting a seed, and we start to water that seed and help to show the client how to do that over time so they can cultivate that. We can look for safety in the body in certain areas. We can look for that in a memory, a person, or a place from our past, or we can use an imagined safe space for that. A lot of people as well who haven't felt safe for a long time will be a little bit suspect on that as well. It's like, okay, I feel a little bit safe, but what's going to come around the corner? And, we help clients work through that so they can feel more comfortable being safe in their body, because as humans, we will go to what is familiar, not what is necessarily best for our growth. We can start...
So just on that topic quickly, for some people, even finding a sense of neutrality in the body can be huge. Like, I know it was not safe to experience my body for a very, very, very long time, having been in the grips of heroin addiction and prison systems and all of that sort of stuff for many, many years. It's like, coming out of that, coming into my body, there was just so much terror around coming into my body. And, if that's the case for someone, it can be helpful to just, feel the feet on the ground, feel what it feels like, to feel neutral, to just feel a sense of presence. And that's where linguistics or language can really help, being really flexible with language. We don't have to use the word safety, because that can bring up a lot of resistance for people. We use that as a sort of umbrella term in this topic. But someone just asked, what if you don't know the origin? That's where exploration comes in. We're not necessarily going to just know the origin, like, oh yeah, it happened when I was 3 years old. That's where this anxiety has its roots. It comes through exploration of the anxiety, and we may get images and whatnot. And it's not actually necessary to know the origin in order to integrate the experience. It can just help,
But generally we don't. Yeah. Generally, that's why we come in and start to do this work, and we open up a dialogue with the body. And then we start to see what presents itself. Because, a lot of people get so frustrated because we just don't consciously know, where this came from. And that the conscious mind is like a ravenous dog that wants answers. It wants to understand everything. Whereas, by working in the body, we're sort of working with a different part there. So, most people who come in for this work, they don't know the origin.
That's it. And I've had so many clients, helping them work through some stuff, and the origin never comes up. They never get that, oh, I know this originated then. Some people might, it's like, oh, vaguely feel like it's actually, my mother's and I just inherited it. Some people might have that. So they get a vague idea. They don't know, but it's not necessary, but it can come up through exploration.
Yeah, and we think about, one of the categories of trauma, there's the genealogical, like Matt said, pre-conscious or precognitive. So this is before the age of around 18 months to 2 years, because the actual part of our brain that can recall circumstances hasn't been formed yet. So what happens then, we still store memories, but they are purely memories in the body. And so that we aren't going to be able to consciously get a visual, unless it's imagined to an extent, for back then. However, we can work through the sensations and contortions that happened in the body, because that's purely a body memory that would happen before that time.
And when that happens, then the pattern can also fall away and integrate it, because it's primarily in the body. It doesn't necessarily have to be an image in the mind or a memory in the mind.
Yeah. That's right. And so we move from them, we start to invite in the orphan part. We've just covered that. And then we start to discern the emotion. We can have something called an overcoupling of emotions. We haven't got time to go right into that today, but we can have many emotions overcoupled with each other. We start to discern predominant emotions around what comes up. We work around finding those origins, as we were speaking about, and then we help the client move through and start to process these sensations and these emotions and whatever's coming up with them, with the intention that all is welcome here. And we can help them start to move through that. We have different techniques. You can see there's pendulation and cohabitation, dimmer switch, merging and distancing, belief investigation, rhythmic breathing. We can use movement. You can see the emergency regulation measures there. We can have some shaking and that kind of thing. What we are doing is we are starting to get this energy moving throughout the body, because it wants to move through the body. We haven't consciously done it, but subconsciously we've held it within our system, within our soma. And it wants to let go. We just kind of have to get out of the way. And the process is one of helping people realize that and helping them get out of their own way and let it move through the body. Once we've actually moved through the sensations and the emotions and everything that's come up, we can start to find some resolution and completion around the event. This is when we can start to bring the neocortex back online, and we can start to create some new meaning around whatever we've worked through in the session. There may be other emotions that need to be worked on. You can see kind of an arrow that goes back up to that phase if we have more emotions to work through, and that's perfectly fine. But we need to move from the bottom up. We come to that neocortex at the end, and we create more meaning. Someone just said, can you do this work visually? You can. Some people are more visual than others. Some people, there'll be more imagery or visualizing memories and that kind of thing. Oh, virtually. Okay, they wrote it again. Yeah.
I was going to say, well, it doesn't work if you're just imagining it. You have to be in the felt sense.
It's a good question, though, even though it was a typo.
Yeah. Virtually, visually, I would say, that's more, just to answer that question, even though it wasn't the question. Visually, I would say that's more in the realm of imagination. So we could imagine being in the waterfall, but what we want to include is the feeling of how it is to be near the waterfall in the body. But can we do this work virtually? Like, I'm assuming they mean over Zoom or Skype and stuff. Like, yeah, for sure. I've done all my sessions virtually for a long time now when I do one-on-ones.
Yeah, can definitely be done online. And then we'll finish up a session by checking in with the nervous system, making sure that the client is more regulated when they came in. And if they're still a little bit dysregulated, then we can use different techniques around being able to help them feel in a more regulated state. And it's probably just worth touching on here. Ideally, we're not like, hey, at the end of the session, someone's completely removed this emotion. They've had a massive epiphany and realization. They're going to change all this stuff in our life. Although that can happen. But also, if someone is even able to contain anger 5% more than they could than when they first came in, that's also an extremely successful session. Yeah, we just want to move, because containment is so important. We're not going to just resolve everything. You'll find out, depends on how far you are down the rabbit hole of doing this work, but there's always more stuff to uncover. It's kind of a never-ending journey that, that can be another trap in of itself. But, if we're better able to contain an emotion that we were unable to contain at the end of the session, that's also just as successful as the epiphany and all the realizations and that kind of thing as well.
And when we say contain, in the way we use the word, it's like I'm able to experience this without tipping completely into overwhelm and getting hijacked by the emotion. So say I'm experiencing anger at my partner or my kids or whatnot, and I lose the plot, I explode. That's, getting hijacked. That's not feeling contained. And so if I go into a session and I'm able to experience the anger without it exploding outwardly, or turning into self-hatred, turning against myself, I'm able to contain it and feel it. Put my hands on my body, because that's like a physical feeling of the representation of what I mean. It's like I'm able to experience it and stay conscious and present. That's, containment. And that's a huge step, because life's always going to throw things at us. We're always going to have hectic experiences. There's always going to be distress. There's no point where, there's no finish line where we get where that no longer happens to us. As long as we're in a human body, it's like, how can we contain our experience? So is contain the same as be with? In our way we use the word, I'm able to be with my experience without getting hijacked by it. And so there's a sense of contain. There's a container that the experience is happening within.
Yeah, it's like, well, I can now be with this anger for 5 minutes without being completely dysregulated. Whereas before, 10 seconds, I can't do it, I have to run away. Okay, so that means we're better able to contain that sensation. Someone asked about the different processing modalities, the processing techniques. We have different processing techniques. What we do, it'll take too long to go through them all, but we did an entire Facebook Live on those techniques. So it's in the guides section of this group. So in this group, the Trauma Informed Support Group, if you go to the guides section, there'll be a live there called 5 Techniques for Processing Emotions. And that's a 45 or 50-minute video where we go into all of those 5, plus actually another one in depth. So that'd be the best place to check that out. So now I want to have a bit of a chat about our Embodied Processing Practitioner training. This is all of what Matt and I have been speaking about today. If you want to learn more from us and work more with us in a deeper way, then this training is our life's work. We have students from all around the world now getting amazing results with this, whether it's they want to gain an understanding, a comprehensive understanding of trauma, learn a modality to work somatically with people, and also deepen into their own healing journeys. This is a great place to do it. Also connect with a supportive community. We have our student community, which is amazing. People connecting, doing sessions on each other, practicing techniques, sharing their wins and losses and everything in between. It's wonderful that we live in this online world and we can connect with people everywhere, which is what's happening on this live. We've got people all over the world, but we do kind of miss that community aspect and we feel a little bit disconnected. So what we're trying to do with this training is we're teaching all this stuff, but also trying to connect people as well, so we can have that element, which is really, really important. This is just some of the testimonials of people who've come through our training. One of them's blocked out. I'll see if I can move us, Matt. I'm going to move us across. You can check out Trustpilot if you want. Just search the Center for Healing. Melissa, if you're in the comments, if you could add our Trustpilot link, that'd be great. We have well over 100 reviews at a 4.9 star rating. We just love hearing about people taking this work out into the world and, helping people in their community and seeing that ripple effect going out. Sonia, thank you for that comment. We love having you in the community. Really, really appreciative of you. So yeah, we'll go to the next one. So what's included? So lifetime access to our video modules. There's about 40 hours or so of me and Matt talking about what we've talked about today, but in a lot more depth and a lot more stuff as well. Lifetime access to that online student community. There's monthly Q&A calls via Zoom with myself and Matt, and also we have our certified pracs running study groups. There's pretty much a live call on every weekend that can be attended if you're available. Those study groups are great. We can get together and just bounce ideas off each other, talk about life or some of the material in the course, and then our community on Facebook has pretty much daily interaction of people looking for a practice buddy or sharing something or updates on the course. Our modality is accredited through the IICT, so you can gain insurance in pretty much most countries around the world. And also we have 80 continued professional development points for people who are already in the industry. At the end of the certification, our students become embodied processing practitioners, meaning they can use the modality with clients. As I said, we find that there's either three types of people that kind of come into our training. Some of them just want to deepen their own journey. They're on this path and want to learn some new tools and go through a healing process themselves. Other people want to step into the industry and start to help people. And then we also have a lot of coaches, therapists, psychologists, healers coming into it to add another tool to their tool belt on this journey as well. Because you have joined us today, I think Melissa has already put the link in the comments, but we'll post it again in a minute. We're offering 40% off for anyone who wants to join us in the Embodied Processing Practitioner training today. All you have to do is enter EP40 at checkout, and that will be a discount for you. Someone has said, how long do we have access to the Q&A calls? So the Q&A calls are every month. They're all recorded. So everybody who joins now has access to all of the previous ones as well. And the study groups, most of them are recorded, but they're there pretty much every weekend to join and enter the discussion as well. Like I said,
just want to add, lifetime access, Mel already, because I was in another community and studied another modality, and we had access to them, but eventually we had to pay a subscription to join the live calls and stuff.
Oh, really?
But there's no subscription. Yeah, I think that's maybe what they meant. If not, maybe someone else is thinking it. But so you've got lifetime access that's included in the purchase of the course. So you can join them in 5 years' time when we're still running them.
That's right. Yeah, some people buy now and they're going to start the training in a few months or whenever it is, and it's lifetime access. It's self-paced, the modules, so we find certification for most people takes around 4 to 6 months. Some do it a little bit quicker, some do it a bit longer, but we want to cater to everyone because everyone's got different things going on in their life. We've got like mums of four with part-time jobs, other people who are throwing themselves into this completely. So we want to kind of make that available to everybody in that aspect. So enter EP40 at checkout for 40% off, and we do have payment plans available as well. All right, we're going to move on to the Q&A. Just before we do, so if you have any questions for me specifically about the embodied processing training, you can hover over my name because obviously I went live here, and send me a message, and I will answer any questions that you have straight after the call or later today. And let's get into some question and answers. So pop any questions that you have about what we have spoken about today or anything else, and we are happy to answer them. I saved a couple from earlier on. Hi guys, I'll put this up on the screen here. Hey guys, thanks for the masterclass. I find it difficult to distinguish between being an empath as well as trauma of sexual abuse in my teens and then domestic violence about 3 years ago. Know that I have always been sensitive. Matt, do you want to touch on that one?
I was just trying to read it, and as I was trying to read it, you were reading it out, but because it was so pixelated, I couldn't see.
Yeah, you got pixelated on your side. So yeah, there's oftentimes that we spoke about, it's like some people have a more sensitive disposition, they have a more sensitive nervous system, which then makes us, and me and Matt both identify as this as well, that then makes us more susceptible to these imprints. So then when we go through some tough life circumstances and we accumulate these imprints, that then makes our nervous system even more heightened. So it's like we don't really know our baseline until we start to, investigate and work through these things. But I found so many people, our natural inclination is when we find out we have this sensitive disposition, we're like, oh crap, this sucks. Why did I get this, right? But when we start to work through these things, we can actually see the gifts of that start to shine through. And Matt spoke about very early in this call when moving through the densities in his body, then the natural expression comes forward. And I find people who are highly sensitive, they have an incredible authentic expression. It just often requires unraveling a lot of what's happened to us in this life, in the body, with these densities.
Cool. So you just answered the question. So someone asked, when I do this process, clients say the emotions can go up to the shoulders, and how can I support them to release it altogether? They say it's going, but not completely. So I would fundamentally there shift the orientation to just exploring what's happening in the shoulders, So like rather than having the agenda of trying to release it out of the shoulders, let's just explore. Let's be with this tension in the shoulders. It will start to move through in its own time. It's kind of, this is what I teach in our training is, what we teach in our training is to have the sort of similar view that if I cut my hand, I slice my hand open, I just create the right environment for my wound to heal itself. And so when the emotions are going up to the shoulders, it's similar to, say, a scab starting to form. Things are starting to move. It's starting to heal. I don't then want to get in and start, forcing things and trying to make it heal quicker. All I do is continue to create that same environment and let it move through on their own. So we take that exploration attitude. So what is it in the shoulders? Let's be with the shoulders. Let's see what's in there. And so I'm pointing here to that shift of orientation.
Yeah. And also it might worth touching on a little bit. Resistance is a big topic that we cover in the training, that we can start to explore. And it's like when we hit these moments of resistance with a client, EP is wonderful at actually starting to explore not so much, the leading up to it, but what's that moment where resistance steps in, which once again is a split. It's like one part of me wants to move over here, like one part of me wants to forgive dad or whatever it was, then the other part's going, no, we're not bloody doing that, right? And then we can start to work with that, I suppose, nexus point of resistance. Some people will get it with anger. It's like, okay, I can turn my anger up to like a 4 out of 10 and then it just shuts down. So that's like, I've learned that it's not safe to be angry past this point, and we can play with that specific point where the anger comes up and shuts down, and we can start to explore that somatically in therapy and help people start to contain that more and more. Really, really interesting work. Because one thing, it comes up in support calls all the time, doesn't it, Matt? This issue of kind of anger and rage and it being suppressed in most human beings.
Yeah, it's a very difficult emotion for people to learn to sit with and to be with. But just resistance, on the topic of resistance, I treat it exactly the same way as I do any other part. Just explore the resistance, see what it's about, look into it. How does it feel in the body, and it can be in the shoulders and in the belly, like a tensing against, so let's explore that tensing. Let's intensify it and feel into it. How does it feel, the resistance feel in the body?
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's if it had language, it's a big no. But then we explore what does that somatic no? What does that feel like for you? What does that look like? And we explore that. It's like we take something that's mostly out of conscious awareness and we really, investigate it. And it's amazing some of the information and things that can come out of that. Someone says, I'm curious as to how codependency might be related to traumatic imprints. I would say completely. Matt, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, agree. I think it is part of a trauma response.
Yeah, so we can use
survival.
Yeah, so a lot of people, can use codependent relationships kind of like they would use a drug or alcohol or gambling. That's the go-to. Like, what can I find? So we spoke about finding a healthy resource of safety. When people reach for like alcohol, drugs, or something else, they don't have a healthy resource of safety. So they're reaching for something that gives them kind of the best that they know. And so people do that with relationships as well. And like anything, like an addict who doesn't now have their drug, it's like when a codependent relationship, when we leave, oftentimes there's an anxious attachment style there. We didn't get into attachment styles today, but oftentimes there's a very anxious attachment style. And so we cling to other people. We cling to them because they also start to make up part of our identity and we don't want them to leave. So yeah, absolutely, codependency is, and plus, not just that, culturally, like every love song is basically a story of codependence. I'm nothing without you, I need you, all of that kind of stuff is the language of a codependent relationship. So it's reinforced culturally as well. What else? I'm just scrolling through. Yes, I think it's resistance from them. Thank you. No problem.
Someone just asked about our perspective on ADHD and traumatic imprints. It's probably a bit too in-depth to go into at the minute, but I would look into Gabor Mate and his perspective on ADHD and trauma. He goes really in-depth. I think he's got a whole book on it, doesn't he?
Yeah, Scattered Minds.
Yeah.
It's called. So I would look at that. Look, there's many different factors of ADHD, and then there's arguments around what percentage each of those factors make up. I just finished reading Johan Hari's new book, Stolen Focus, and there's a great chapter on ADHD in there. And I would, highly recommend reading that and Gabor's book to get a bit of an understanding. But there is, many factors that go into that. One thing that Gabor does talk about is that to say that it's purely genetic, doesn't make any sense, because can the incidence of diagnosis go up so much in 1 to 2 generations when it takes hundreds of generations for our genes to change? So there's a combination of, I believe, traumatic imprints, society, the way schools are structured. There's a whole host of things that go into that, which is probably maybe a topic for a full live, to be honest.
So everything you're talking about, like says to me, well, it's some sort of survival adaptation.
Yeah.
But someone asked, so the course is online modules, you work at your own pace, then there's live Q&A, like live tutorial. And so, so like there's 9 modules, 40 or something hours of video content that you go through at your own pace. And the live calls, there's one every weekend. Me and Ryan run one of them a month, and the others are run by certified practitioners.
Yeah.
So essentially, there's that live stuff as well.
Yeah, and then once the theory has been worked through and you're ready to practice, then we reach out to the community on Facebook, and we find people to give and receive sessions with. And a lot of people, find a few practice buddies that they end up having, good relationships with, because they've been giving and receiving sessions. And it's kind of a bit of free therapy. It's good. Is it genetic or modeling? I assume we're still talking about ADHD here. Like it's both, but to what extent, basically. Like I said, the book that I just read, I've read a lot on it, but obviously I've got a bit of recency bias because I just finished this book. But the main argument for it being genetic is twin studies that have been done around it. But in the book they describe there's a lot of, that's not great science to do the identical twin and the non-identical twin studies to determine whether something's genetic, because actually identical twins and non-identical twins actually have quite different environments growing up than you would think. So it's very, very hard to factor all of this stuff in. With my answer to all that stuff is like, what's in my control? I had someone ask me around this with addiction just the other day. I've heard it, before, like how much of it's genetic, and it's like, I don't know, right? But let's say it's 50-50, just for argument's sake. It's 50 nature, 50 nurture. What do I have control over, and what can I work on, basically? Because if I just say, well, it's my genes, then all of a sudden the keys are out of my hands. They're in the predetermined destiny of my genetics. But then there's also the field of epigenetics, where my environment and the way that I live my life and have been treated determines whether my genes turn on or off. My gene expression is determined by that. So I'm always, what am I going to do with that information, and what can I actually make changes on? All right, we'll do one more. Someone has I've got a few more questions here. Okay, we'll go. I've been finding relief in marijuana, not in a compulsive way. Just wondering what you reckon weed does to the nervous system. One thing Matt and I talk about is there's nothing wrong with anything, right? It's our relationship to something that can become a problem. So that's why I would never say, the weed's an issue, alcohol's an issue, food's an issue, like we all have to eat. It just depends on our relationship and being quite honest around that. But as far as I know, Matt, you can chime in as well, but marijuana isn't particularly toxic to our body, not massively anyway. There are far more toxic things that we can take.
Well, and it's not the drug that's the problem. It's the orientation and the reason that we're using it. So like if you ask someone like, what does alcohol do for you when you go to a party? It makes me feel more connected. I can be myself. I don't feel as shy. I feel like more like me. Like I can just be me. That's so common. With people using any sort of drug, and that's telling that the issue isn't the alcohol. The issue is that I don't feel safe to be me. It's hard for me to connect with people at a party. I might be socially awkward, or I might have anxiety, all that sort of stuff. So the issue is the disconnect, the feelings of it's not safe to be me, and the anxiety. And so we're using, say, the marijuana or the alcohol to regulate or cover up those experiences, those dysregulated states. And so that's how we view addiction. So it's a symptom of a dysregulated nervous system that's seeking to find homeostasis. We're seeking to be able to be ourselves and feel safe.
Yeah. Do you go into generational transference of trauma within the body in training? Yep, we go through genealogical trauma in one of the modules when we cover all the different types of trauma. Yes, we do. Since we're asking more loose questions, These questions aren't too loose. I wouldn't have described them as loose. Did you study the topic of highly sensitive people and what's your view on it? Yep, we covered that a little bit earlier in the live. I think it's really important work by Dr. Elaine Aaron. There's a couple of others doing the work as well, but hers seems to be the most comprehensive. Seems to be true that there is that kind of 15 to 20% of the population with more sensitive nervous systems, which just means we feel more, and it's not just all the heavy stuff, it's also the good stuff as well. We're greatly affected by music and that kind of thing. It's interesting though, in her research as well, she has studied other animal species, and a few of the species that she has studied, she's found that it's been the same for them. So there's been that 15 to 20% of an animal population that have more sensitive nervous systems. So she theorizes that it may be for the collective's best interests of survival that a percentage of the population are wired that way. Yeah, because let's say I have a tribe. What are you going to say?
I was going to say that's interesting, because that way, as you were talking, I've never read the book, but as you were talking, it was like that was the conclusion that I'd come to. It's like, oh, it must have something to do with collective survival.
Yeah, so it's like if, let's say, we're in a tribe of 50 people and 15 to 20% are HSPs, then all of a sudden they might pick up on that rival tribe who are coming in, or they might hear that crack of a stick in the woods, or that kind of thing. So that's the theory, but obviously not proven. But I still find it very, very interesting.
Yeah, just more of an attunement to the environment, so we can warn other people and different sort of things in order to help us survive as a collective. But in modern culture, I could see how it could become really. My experience is that it can become problematic in different ways, and cause suffering for the person who is highly sensitive.
Yeah. We've got someone who's an identical twin. Hello. Intrinsic or extrinsic takes power. Yep. Okay, that's from the previous question. I find the difficult part is about connection with others. Do you have any tips around this? It's normally a slowly approach with that. It's like so many people are disconnected from others because they see a connection with someone else as unsafe in some way, generally due to that learned behavior, these imprints. It's not safe to connect with someone, or it's safe to connect this much but no more. I'll let you see this much of me, but you're not going to see any more, because all of a sudden, like I was talking about with the emotion of anger, it's the same here. There's a point where the system goes not safe. So I'll kind of keep people at arm's distance. I'll let them in a little bit, but not fully in. And so that's a process of you need to readapt the nervous system in that aspect, because the beauty of our nervous system, it adapts on these certain ways to become dysregulated, but we can readapt it to become more regulated. It just takes a bit of time, So it's like being able to find those connections. I'd start with one, someone who you really trust, and then start to try and build that connection and see if you can open up a bit more, so you can let yourself know, hey, this is okay for me to do this. It's like you need to find counter evidence to what has shown up in your life already. That way we can start to rewire. Do you have any thoughts on that, Matt?
Yeah, my experience has been, the more I sort of integrate the parts of me that I orphaned and whatnot, the more I find a sort of natural connectedness. I don't have to try when someone asked about the, any sort of tips, it's, my only tip would be is like, see someone who knows what they're doing and start to work with the reason for disconnect. How that in the body, how that feels, and let that unwind in its own time. And so what we, usually do is attempt to then try and connect, but that can be a kind of cognitive bypassing. We can create these sort of mental structures and attempt to connect through those, and it can feel forced. We can get really fatigued trying to force it, and it can create more internal struggle, more psychic splits, and more dissociation. So, the shift is to then, okay, well, let's go into the disconnect in the body, how that feels in the body. Let's look at the origins of that, how it feels, and let that sort of unravel and unwind. And, it's actually really natural for us to connect. And so someone just asked as well, addiction is a symptom of a dysregulated nervous system seeking homeostasis. So it's seeking to find home. It's like, when I was using heroin, it was like I would be in such a panic, physical withdrawals of the opiates. My nose would be running, my eyes would be watering, I'd have physical aches and all the opiate physical symptoms, but there'd be this panic. But as soon as I'd go and score and put it in my pocket, something would find homeostasis. It would find relief, like, okay, I'm safe now, even though I hadn't used it. So that tells me that my addiction wasn't a symptom of heroin being physically addicted, but it was my nervous system seeking safety, seeking homeostasis. And as soon as I found it, put it in my pocket, it's okay now. And I wouldn't even have to use it straight away anymore. That panic was gone. So that's just a little example I use of that sort of is pointing to the that statement that I said.
Okay, good. I'll just see if there's any more. Loose as in not the questions about the course, but trauma in general. That's right. I was just making a bit of fun. I just thought it was funny, like loose questions. I don't know why I found that funny. Okay, I think that's it. I think we'll wrap it up there. A big thank you to everybody that has joined us today, and I really appreciate all the interaction and all the questions. Like I said, if you have any more questions that you want to ask privately, just hover over my name here in the group, and there'll be an option to send me a message, and I'll keep an eye out for those. And really appreciate you joining us, Matt. Thank you as always, and we'll hope we were able to add some value today.
Thanks, Ryan.